What's up, guys? Welcome back. Today we're going to be continuing our conversation about functions, and more specifically talking about inputs. So why don't we go ahead and get started? Last class, which I guess if you're not here, then what I would do is I'd pull up VS Code and go to I guess maybe quiz 1. Some of you were working on quiz 1. Some of you other scripts. So I'm in test.lua, and last time we were working on this local function. Let's see. Local function print hello world my func. And so I asked you guys to make this your own by changing up the name and things like that. So what we're gonna do today is as is, our function is rather bland. It doesn't do too much. It just prints something, and we want it to do more. So what we're going to do is I'm going to teach you about inputs. And in order to demonstrate an input, we are going to also use the math library, or it's basically a math table. If you remember our discussion about the variable type table, there's a table called math, and in it is a bunch of functionality. So you can have multiplication, and I think I showed you in the functions list the math.absolute. So it returns the absolute value. So yeah, we're gonna take some inputs into our function. We're gonna do some math on it, and then we're going to print the results. First thing, let's talk about inputs. So like in our analogy, when I was describing what a function was like, it being a box, we have this side over here, and so that we're going to be dumping something into this box, and then getting it's going to do something inside. So remember how I was telling you about these parentheses? Functions are very parentheses focused. So you call a function with the parentheses and whatnot. Well, these not only designate a function, but they also hold certain things, and those would be the variables. Okay, so here I've written out function twice, or our function called func. And the first one, the green one, is the created one, the one that we created, we put in place. So it's going to have end down here and then text in between, or script in between. And then the blue one is the call. So it's when we actually call our function, just like we did in our script last class. So that's just my way of designating between the two. So the function, now I've stretched out the parentheses so that we can put stuff inside. And I want to show you kind of the relationship here between these two, the creation and the call of the function. So in a function, we are going to accept some input that we don't know the value of. So let's say we put x right here. So it's just a placeholder. It's some sort of placeholder that's going to accept an input. And then inside of the function that we create, we use x to maybe do some math with, because we're going to accept an integer or something like that. And so we've created a variable effectively. We've created something like this: x equals, and then we've left the other side of the equal sign just kind of open and ready to accept whatever is handed to it. Now, let's say we've set up our function just like that. Now, when we call our function, what we're going to do is inside of these parentheses, we're going to place some value. For instance, 12. And so what's going to happen is when we call, this function and write 12 right there, it's going to throw that 12, it's going to pass it up into x, and x is going to become 12, or it's going to hold 12, right? So there's a box called x, and then 12 is going to get thrown into that box. And then we can use x to do all kinds of different things. So these look different, right? So the creation of function looks different than the call of function. And I hope you understand why. This is where we place our inputs, and an input is something that we're going to pass into the function, right? Into the box. And then inside of that box, it does some processing of that information. And so but yeah, this is where we pass it on. Now, one last thing before we actually demonstrate this. There are several times, quite often, you want to pass in more than one piece of information. And so if we're going to do that, we separate each of those pieces of information by a comma. So here we have two variables, and despite its correlation with Cartesian coordinates, that's not my intention, but it's just x and y, and two variables that are ready and willing to accept information. And so then what you would do is when you call it, you would want to pass in the two pieces of information. This is the simplest form or way of passing information into a function. There are other ways, and there are other rules to consider. Now, don't forget that you're going to need your comma here when you call your function. So don't forget that. Okay, so follow along as I'm typing. We are going to move this print down to make room above it for some code, which we don't need much room for now. But we're basically what we're going to do is we're going to get rid of hello world. And before I put an X in print, let's first place it in where we know our inputs go. So my function and then X, it's going to accept some sort of input, and I can reference that input by using X. Okay. Now let's run down here and actually put something in my function. We have to give my function something. And so let's do what we did in our drawing. We'll write 12 there. Now here, if we go to print, we don't write 12, we write X, because that's our placeholder. It allows us to pass in any information, and then it will, in this case, simply print that number. So let's Control save, or Control S, which is save it. If you don't have a terminal, open up terminal, a new terminal. I do already, and I'm going to clear my whoops. Let's go down here to the terminal. All right, so let's clear our screen, and then Lua. And so remember, we got to type our interpreter first, and then we write out the text or the script that we want it to interpret, and press enter. And as we expected, right, it printed 12. No big surprise here. We passed in 12. 12 went into X, and then X was printed. Whoop-de-doo. Now, let's do a little bit of math on this, okay? So we're going to say, let's just say X times 2. Save that. Come down here. I'm going to clear. Up arrow recalls the last commands. Enter. And there we have 24. So we can see here clearly that we didn't print 12. Something happened to 12. It was doubled. Well, where did the doubling happen? Right here, right in the print function. And so clearly it must have come through my func and then into this area here, and then been printed by this command. Real quick, let's go ahead and add a second variable, and don't forget the comma. But we put our input, our second input, we separate our inputs with the comma, and then as we're calling, we separate the inputs with, again, a comma. So we can write it like that. Now, we're not using y as of yet. We've just passed it in, and VS Code gives you this coloring option where it's grayed out in it, and so you know that it's not being used. You don't have to use it, but I'm going to go ahead and use it and say plus y. Sounds good to me. We save this, come down to our terminal, up arrow, Lua test, print it, and there you go. There's 3 added to our 24. Okay, so I've removed the extra lines and just kind of brought it down to the print because that's all that we really need. Now, briefly, let me demonstrate to you the math library. Make sure you're not capitalized. So if we type math dot, it'll give us this drop down. For some reason, that's not an option. But you can see here that all of these, as indicated to the right in that drop down, are functions, and you pass in some variables. So here's something fun you can mess around with, and I want you to use some of these options. Oh, huge! That's not a function. It just gives you a number. But anyways, so use some of these functions to create some interesting outputs, and this would be fun if we typed random and then such and such. Follow the explanations that are given to you. I won't get into all that, but this is the way that you would access the math library. So that's what I want you to do. I want you to create your own function. Create your own function, like you have done. You've already done that. But I want you to add some inputs to that function, and then use the math library to do some interesting different manipulations on those at least two inputs that you're passing into your function. So thanks for watching, guys. I will catch you next time.